Hello, and welcome to Reducing PeopleSoft Audit Time from Months to Minutes, presented by Appsian. My name is Scott Lavery, Head of Marketing here at Appsian, and I'd like to thank you all for participating in the PeopleSoft Innovation Summit. This is the last session of the day. We've had 5 insightful, we'll call it insightful, hours of awesome PeopleSoft content today, and it's continuing on tomorrow. There are 5 more awesome sessions tomorrow, so please go back to that registration page and you can take a look at the agenda for tomorrow and sign up for a session. Everything is still open. But before we kick things off, just a few housekeeping notes for you. First of all, everyone is on mute. The session is being recorded, and we will be posting this and all of the other sessions to that registration page so you can have free on-demand viewings. Those will be posted within the next week or so. The session today will be 45 minutes, and we'll have somewhat limited time for Q&A, so you can certainly either reach out to the presenters directly or go ahead and put your questions in the questions section of the control panel, and we can just reach back out to you at a later date. So our speakers today are both from Appsian, Greg Sosna and Greg Wendt. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to the first Greg Sosna, to begin today's presentation. Greg?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Depends where you're coming from. And let me just start a little bit with a brief agenda of what we're going to cover today. First, we're going to do a quick introduction of Appsian and your host today, so you know what we are and who we are and what we do. Some of the top ERP data risks and security trends, what we're seeing happening around. Definitely ERP audit and visibility changes, and then we'll discuss in some detail the Appsian 360 use cases. Also, we'll run a live demo of the functionality of Appsian 360, and that should take us, like Scott said, about 40 minutes or so, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end of it. So that's our agenda. Let's start the introductions. Oops. So my name is Greg Sosna. I'm based down under New Zealand, and I look after the Asia Pacific region, including Australia. And it's my second year working in Appsian Security. It's just like the people who founded the company. I'm from a solid technical background, over 20 years in IT and 16 years in the PeopleSoft technical space. My experience includes higher ed, government, commercial organizations. In terms of PeopleSoft, I started on version 7.5, straight into the techie stuff, and I looked into, after HR, student admin, now campus solutions, CRM, and financials. Now there's another Greg on the call, and that's Greg Wendt. I'll let him introduce himself.
Thanks, Greg. Yes, Greg Wendt, Executive Director of the Security Solutions here at Appsian. I've been with Appsian about coming up on 6.5 years. Before that, I started with PeopleSoft on version 5, so I was a little bit ahead of Greg on that particular aspect. But I've worked in retail, higher ed, and oil and gas. Being in the Texas area, if you don't touch oil and gas at one particular point, you just haven't really lived in Texas. So with that, though, enterprise architect for most of those organizations. So I've been dealing with PeopleSoft, as I said, since version 5. I've done all the upgrades, have had to have done audit and incident responses with different challenges in the past as well. So back to you, Greg.
Thank you. And Greg's done a fair share of internal and external security reviews as well. So we're really lucky to have him on board today and joining us to fill in the gaps and do the live demo a bit later too. So thank you for that, Greg. And what we do at Appsian Security is that we help you protect the ERP data and transactions that drive your organization. So we've put a lot of control inside of many different modules. And in terms of ERP, we work with PeopleSoft, SAP, and Oracle eBusiness Suite, specifically to give you granular control over your data with our Appsian 360 product. We also give you the visibility, so you have the understanding of what's going on inside your system. Appsian's roots go back around 15 years back. It was founded by the ex-PeopleSoft employees after the Oracle acquisition, and the company formed in 2012. You might have heard the original name Grey Heller and the previous product ERP Firewall. This is how it started. As part of PeopleSoft security platform, we've developed a bolt-on module which lives inside of PeopleSoft at the web services tier, and the plugin has access and understands PeopleSoft attributes, so it acts like a filter for all incoming traffic, and because of that, it can see transactions and data passing in between the system and the user. So we're able to collect the detailed and granular information from the source and log it. So the best thing about it is that it doesn't require any customization and it lives inside of your existing infrastructure, so the implementation is fast and simple. Right, so let me start with some of the risks that go undetected most of the time. So most of the time, when you think about your ERP system and really thinking about how you've changed the use of it in the past year specifically, it is difficult to see and track what's going on as users are accessing the system. You can now have a lot of compromised user credentials. When you think about the amount of phishing and spear phishing campaigns that happened in the last 6 months alone, where organizations have been heavily targeted because of the shift in how your employees are now working. Typically, it used to be that only perhaps the self-service was accessed remotely or outside of the network. Now you have a complete access to the system from external networks because the work just has to be done. And it definitely is a large shift. And with that shift, there is a shift to personal devices. How many organizations have really set up to send everybody home in a span of a couple of weeks and work on a machine that was not provisioned by the IT department? Well, not everybody was. So now you have personal devices, telephones, tablets, personal laptops, and these devices connect into your network now. And these devices could be shared with others. Perhaps someone's child is using the tablet. So you really don't know what's happening on that computer, for example. Another top risk is data exfiltration. And what I mean by that, it's really taking, say, PeopleSoft, for example. You can quickly download a query to Excel. That is probably one of the largest ways that mass exfiltration of data is happening inside of PeopleSoft. When you're thinking about it as what should really happen from a security point of view, you really shouldn't be accessing query remotely. Well, not without at least going through some additional security or validation or verification, whether it be two-factor authentication or something like that. After hours access from an untrusted location, performing download to Excel, these are the kind of actions that should always raise a red flag. In terms of compliance, audit reports are always a challenge. Anybody who looks after a large ERP system knows dealing with the audit reports takes time, as a lot of the information is not just available without a good amount of digging and looking for the required information. And this is not even considering the GDPR and California Consumer Privacy Act, all these legal frameworks that set precedents of being able to see and record us as to who is viewing and accessing the sensitive information inside of this environment. And a question often pops up about the elephant in the room. What did your PeopleSoft admin do? What did they touch? Have they accessed their system? And it could be a DBA or PS admin or HR admin, whoever. And really is regardless of whether this is PeopleSoft, EBS, or SAP or any other system, because it's a question of what your admins are really doing. They always have or can have a complete access to your system. So the question is raised, what they're doing, what they're touching, and it's very important to be able to answer those questions. And also now, as well, the privileged misuse of data. It is always difficult when you have an environment, then when you take a copy of production and populate it into your development, test, and UAT environment, the users and developers will push the boundaries. They will try to see if the kid next door was admitted to the university or what your manager is earning, these type of things. So just because they have the ability to do so or the access to do that doesn't mean that they should be doing it and should be able to do it. You see, they can't see it in production, so you really don't want them to see it in development environment either. So you want to make sure that all those controls and the audit flags and the visibility in the particular style of access are all in there, which really now comes into business policy evaluations. This brings me to what we can definitely see happening inside of the SAP systems or financial systems a bit more, to where people might be potentially able to say discount sales that might be affecting your business as a whole, and how you're going to be able to collect the money, cash flows. It really can affect everything. Maybe even releasing POs of a certain amounts that are beyond the scope of what you're able to do. And then you end up with transaction theft and fraud. Manipulating bank details is probably the largest theft areas inside of PeopleSoft systems. Whether that happens to be payroll check or vendor check, or the money is shipped off to an offshore account somewhere else. Creating and paying fake vendors using real purchase orders and these sorts of things as well. So even on the campus solution side, we've seen a theft with transactional fraud when you're doing a direct deposit to refund class fees. So we've heard of a case that an account number was updated before a large number of classes was dropped, and the refund was issued automatically to the hacker's bank account. So there really are a number of things that can go undetected, and usually it's a combination of things. Layering a couple of these things here, whether it's compromised credentials and then leveraging that theft. So now when you think about the connected economy and the challenges that are there today, think about how the organizations had to respond in the last 6 months. The dynamics, the changes that have come in, the increased push to have a very mobile workforce. If you think about it, you're really not just trying to enable self-service anymore. You are now trying to move your entire business productivity online. And there are a lot of choices you have to make between security and productivity. And there are a lot of things to consider right now. Thinking about how and what people will be accessing and from where, or how to log that and how to be still in control of your own data. There's a lot of strategic thinking of how to proceed. You know, the proliferation of connected devices, like I said earlier, smartphones, laptops, tablets, caused the organizations to redefine their network boundaries. The ERP applications today are much more exposed than they ever have been. And today, the access to the network is no longer limited to the local user population. They can now access enterprise systems from overseas on their own device, and attacks are quite common and becoming way more sophisticated. Some of the statistics on the right, 64%, and that's Oracle and SAP, deployments have been breached in the last 24 months. That's from an independent market survey by IDC, International Data Corporation, released in the second half of last year. And now we have twice the number of security incidents on the web applications than we had last year. And judging by the stories in the news, this is still exponentially growing. It's the use of these applications. The hackers got smarter. They typically are actually going after the person and not the application anymore. And then you have people giving up their credentials, and it's not done on purpose, but instead they're being tricked by accident. And that is how they're going to expose the organization access to risks. So you might already have a single sign-on where you can disable it in one single location, and that can really help. It's going to be an interesting year as to what is happening. And if you're interested, there is a very insightful report by Verizon that explores how COVID-19 has impacted the cybersecurity and how it's changing the way the hackers are exploiting the situation. There's some very interesting bedtime reading there. So now, thinking about how you and your organization is going to react to it, it's all about response time. You have to be able to understand what's going on, that you can respond quickly and efficiently to what's happening inside of your environment. And it's really all about, if you have a better understanding, you'll be able to make better decisions on how to respond. And a lot of organizations don't necessarily have that detail of data that is going to allow them to make that very quick response. They are going to have to dig through and sift through logs and information as to how long and what actually happened in the environment. And if you look at the average response time on this slide in here, 6 months. That's half of a year. That means your resources will be tied up, projects going to be delayed, and surely there are better things that they can be doing right now, not to mention the monetary value of that lost time. And it's not just the PS admin time that is lost, because we, on a regular basis, talk to different people all the time, and it's the standard flow of actually what happens in the business. One small delay with a single project often has a domino effect on many other projects. The number of people affected by an event like this would mean a significant financial hit to the company. And going back to the 6 months timeline is just not good enough. It is not something we want our customers to have. We want our customers to be able to pull up the information in minutes and seconds. That is our goal. That's why we want our performance and the information on the system to be able to respond real time, so they can make correct decisions as to what's happening inside of the environments. Now, moving on to some of the compliance issues, data privacy as whole is continuing to change and evolve and grow. And GDPR was really just the beginning. right now is the baseline that a lot of organizations and countries are looking to implement. And some countries outside of the EU are implementing GDPR-like legislations as well. The most recent one I've read of being Japan. And that's because GDPR is consistent. So they're just using it as an example, I guess. Regardless of whatever the compliance issue is, the main thing with these privacy laws is that it finally is something that can be enforced. The dollars and cents is now tied to what's going to happen. And this is going to change how businesses think and drive forward. Now, all of a sudden, you have to think about capturing some sensitive data. Is it worth carrying the cost? What happens if there is a breach? Do I have a business reason to be holding that data for a particular employee anymore? Maybe it's because they have been terminated so many years ago. Maybe it's because for tax reasons. So maybe you have to hang to the information for 7 years or whatever the number is. But yeah, okay, that's fine. But what happens after that time? Do I just delete it? And what about someone who applies for a job or study and they are not successful? How long do you keep their data in your system? So what I mean when I say about carrying costs, it's all of that. There's going to be an expense for holding that. And some of the security reviews that we've done in the recent past, and there's definitely been a shift. A lot of people are trying to understand what type of data they're collecting, what they're doing, what they're going to do with the data, and who's got access to that. And I think that's a direct result of the new privacy laws coming into effect. So other than GDPR in Europe, we've got Singapore recently updated the Personal Data Protection Act. I mentioned Japan's almost copy and paste of GDPR legislation. Australian Privacy Act reforms just passed, and New Zealand's latest changes that are coming off in effect in December. And in terms of the Americas, Greg, can you fill us in on the recent developments in states and Canada?
Yeah, we've definitely got the California Consumer Privacy Act that's been coming on board, that a lot of people were concerned about. And in Canada, there's the PEDA Act. In Canada, I mean, kind of going back to what you were talking about with GDPR, I actually heard that they were thinking about, almost taking that exactly like it sits. Some of the different states, I've heard somewhere between about 12 to 15 different states have some form of legislation in process right now about data privacy, breach notifications, all of those types of things. So I'm hoping at some particular level that we can get a federal law inside of the United States, because trying to track 50 different states would be horrendous from a business perspective. I mean, I guess they do it from a tax flow inside of different softwares, but it would definitely be a challenge when you're talking about trying to track all that data in the different laws in 50 different states. So hopefully we end up with a federal one. So back to you, Greg.
Right. Yeah, thanks. Definitely some challenges there. And moving on, and much of the time when you're asked to provide an incident report, and I look at my time as PS admin running these applications, me trying to understand what somebody did or what they accessed or what they touched inside of the system, it can really seem like this picture here on my presentation, looking for a needle in a haystack. It's just so difficult to sift through either non-targeted data like logs, or it might be that you just don't have all of this. So now you're trying to piece together from information coming from a firewall or a proxy or a load balancer, and you have bits and pieces of information that you're trying to correlate as what's really occurred in the ERP system. And it's interesting, as I know by talking to people who have done audits and had to deal with breaches for a long time, Greg in here, and trying to figure out what really has happened. We hear of organizations that spend 2,000 hours doing a single incident response. And that's an entire year to try to figure out what actually has happened. Obviously, at that point, that is a red flag, that you don't have the information that is required to support and respond to audit and compliance and risk. If it's taking you a year to respond to reconstruct what has happened, then you don't have information that you really need. So you won't find that needle in the haystack. Instead, you have to have something that can help you facilitate and enable you with the data you're capturing, and data that you should be capturing and seeing what's happening. So with that, what we're calling Appsian 360 really provides that essential visibility. It is granular information and real-time analytics. So when we're talking about what it can do, it's talking about compliance risk, employee, application performance monitoring, security, and business risk detection. All of those things are built into the application, so you can understand what these users are doing and how they're accessing it. So if you look specifically more towards the business risk or detecting certain security events, maybe someone from your organization wants to know what they're doing off business hours. What's happening in my application? Where did they come from? Did they come from overseas? You've got, you should be able to see the failed login attempts. That's something extremely important if the system is accessible publicly from the internet. Who's attempting to log in? These failed logins will let you know if someone is attempting to access the system, perhaps some script kiddies that are trying to get into your system. Maybe they're using some default credentials like PSPS or VP1, and so on. Things like that will help you understand and let you know that you're being probed. So when you're doing maintenance or PeopleTools update, you need to make sure that these accounts, that these default accounts like that are turned off. The variation in business policies, that could be anything from downloading data to changing business policies and procedures, changing information inside of POs, for example. And then privileged access. Today, it is very, very, very difficult. Then it was very different than it was last year, where everyone lived in a different state system-wide. That is what it is now. So privileged access has definitely changed. How are you tracking of what they're doing? Maybe you just need to validate that a person who used it, to enter the data in the office is still doing the job from, working from home. So are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? Are they doing what you're actually paying them to do? Data compliance. So with this, the goal here is to have information for all your compliance issues and challenges. Some of the things you need to understand, for example, are the things that we talked about earlier. What are the PS admins doing? What do they touch? What do they access? What do they change? But also from the GDPR perspective, we need to be able to tell and to see who viewed certain sensitive data that can be audited, or someone can call in and say, I want to know who's accessed my information, who's seen all my records. How are you going to answer that if you don't have the right information to do it? And forensic investigations, we call that incident response. You got to have the information to be able to perform a valid incident response. It is not something that is going to happen overnight with your systems without detailed logging. And it could be something you need as a result of a phishing attack or dealing with ransom requests, for example, or simply data loss. If you don't have that already in the system, it becomes almost impossible to obtain that information after the fact. So the goal here is to minimize the risk of unnecessary data exposure, regardless of the reason, whether it's fraud, theft, error, or over-provisioning. So no matter what happens, you want to limit that. And finally, one of the things that you will need to do is to track privileged employees as they process transactions. Perhaps I need to understand what they're doing. Or maybe I need to compare employee A with employee B with the amount of transactions that they're doing. Maybe one of them is accessing far more sensitive transactions than the other. Is somebody processing far more POs or approvals? Or is someone, creating vendors and they're doing pay runs? What type of transactions are these people doing? Do you have an admin who is accessing sensitive information? What are they doing in the business level transactions? They shouldn't be there, even though they have the complete access to the system because they have the admin roles. So you really have to monitor what the privileged users are doing and get a grip on what their access is and hold them accountable. And the second point here about the technical employees, about focusing on application uptime rather than report requests, is basically about who will be processing these requests for the type of information we're talking about. They are going to be the frontline people that you go to provide, and they need to provide it to a CISO or a security, chief information officer, or to an audit person. This is the group of people who are busy enough to keep your system working correctly and performing maintenance to it and applying PeopleTools or PAM updates to it. So my point here is that having to respond to these requests for information is not necessarily easy. Sometimes it's not even possible at all. And it is a valuable use, is it a valuable use of their time, especially when this can be automated? and you can display it in a dashboard given to the users that need to see that information. And lastly, you need to understand if somebody has accessed the system in a fraudulent way. For example, if someone arrived with a stolen token, how do you know that someone did that? So with Appsian 360, we can help in multiple ways across all of these. And Greg, why don't we have a look at this in action? So let me just hand over control to the other Greg. Here you go. I think it's all yours.
Got it. So perfect. Thanks, Greg. So yeah, let's talk about and dive into a couple of those different use cases and what we're looking for, because when you're thinking about how you're going to roll PeopleSoft out, you know, even if you're doing certain identity management, single sign-on, those types of things, it's always interesting to be able to know who's logged in, what are they doing, what are they touching, are they accessing things that they shouldn't. So what I'm going to do real quick is just sign into the system here real quick. And oops, just put in the password wrong. So I am going to type it correctly. What I wanted to do is look at some high privileged access. You know, if you think about self-service versus high privilege, that's really one of the drastic shifts. When you think about GDPR, all of these different privacy laws, it's really about understanding who has touched something, who has looked at something, you know, can you validate why they did it? Ironically, I mean, Greg talks about some of the different security reviews we've done. It's frequently a question is who's accessed payroll data, who has changed something, who looked at this information. You know, sadly enough, a lot of the direct deposit thefts that we've actually seen and occurred out there, often not what they'll do is they'll come back at the organization and say, well, it was somebody in HR that made the change, it wasn't me that made it. Well, and if you don't have enough detail to be able to answer that question, or no, you know, say no, it wasn't, this is where it came from, it becomes very difficult. You know, the organization on a whole is most likely going to turn around and pay that check anyway, but it becomes a challenge to understand who is viewing sensitive information. So what I wanted to do real quick is I'm going to go ahead and access some biographical information. And basically what I'm doing at this particular point is really just generating some traffic. So I'm just going to open up a record that doesn't exist. See if somebody will grab there. So what we've got here is, this is something with the application security platform. One of the features that we have inside of there is data masking. This is what we call our click to view. So what we've done is we're masking the sensitive information around that national ID, so it's not going to be displayed by default. So this keeps prying eyes off of it. What we're going to do is click the hyperlink, and thus you can actually see the data. So that's kind of why we call it the click to view. All makes sense. But really what we've done from an audit and logging perspective is we've now tracked that. So we created a log that has the information of who is logged in, what page they're on, what time of day, you know, all of that information, and then whose national ID they looked at. We're not going to populate whose information, you know, like the national ID itself, for example, but we're going to let you know what key was looked at. We're going to do that all very quickly inside of the system. So one of the things I can do is I'll flip over to compliance real quick. Let me shrink this down just by an access point. Let's look at today's information. So I was just, if I flip back over to modify a person, you can see that I'm looking at employee ID KU0040. So I can also see now inside of the Appsian 360 platform that I can track and look at and understand the user ID PS1 did access KU0040. You know, instantaneous results are in near real time pulled over into the system to allow us to know and be able to track this. You know, Greg kind of talked about it a little bit ago. Flipping back to the dashboards real quick, they're all about different personas and who's going to be accessing the system in what role. Compliance is about governance, risk, and compliance. So it's going to be somebody who may not have the expertise as to what PeopleSoft is doing, you know, the true job functions of it. So it's something to where we want to boil up that information in a way where they don't have to bother either one of Greg or I when we were playing that enterprise architect. You know, I don't want to have to go bother my PS admin or my DBA to say, did somebody do something they didn't? You know, now we can actually tell them things that they shouldn't have done right away. You can quickly expand all of this access. So if I change to a quick 90 days, we can get a quick view. Some of the other information, what we've what we're doing is we're adding metadata about the actual transactions themselves and about the PeopleSoft system. So by that, I mean, we're understanding what pages, components have sensitive information. Should there be, alerts? Should there be notifications? All of those types of things about somebody accessing those pages or components, or maybe even with certain personal data on it. So we can see the pages by PPI level, and that's actually breaking down by the private personal information. So level 1, level 2, level 3, for example. We can also track the IP addresses. Going back to an incident response, you don't always know where somebody's coming from or the IP address. So I don't know, who maybe they're accessing from, but I want to track everything by an IP over a period of time, so I can filter in and capture that. Top 10 pages of downloading of sensitive information, other data accessed by different people. If I want to quickly filter in, let's say I want to look at everything that PS1 has done. So now as a compliance person, I want to see specifically one user and who they've accessed. So I can see the different employee IDs that they have accessed inside of the system, all of the pages, all of that information quickly filters to them very specifically. So I can see all of the IP addresses that user has accessed from and performed that click to view to access that real sensitive information. I can also see their components that they access, where they've attempted to download information. So they've done it on personal names and job data 3, for example. Those are obviously both sensitive pages. In tracking how their logins are actually happening. So are they successful, failed? How frequently are they logging into the system? Those types of things I can easily garner. I'm going to flip back over here. When we talk about downloading of sensitive data, Greg talked about from an exfiltration perspective. There's numerous different ways we can do that. Could be query, could be a grid. So on personal data, for example, there's a grid. This contains the national ID. I don't want the data to come out. So if I attempt to download, this is a block that we're actually doing with our application security platform. That's how we're creating that when somebody is trying to attempt to download that information. So this is a positive based log of an event that we know somebody did. And that's really the most important part is going back to the needles in the haystack. We're already stacking the needles up for you. We're finding them for you, and we're going to give them to you so you don't have to go digging through all of those. I'm going to flip back and go to job data here real quick. Once again, just generating some traffic. I'm going to go ahead and open up an executive's compensation. So if I look at his job role, you're going to see that he's the president of the organization. So if I flip over to his compensation, 1, we've got our data masking involved here, but 2, from the aspect of who's accessing what, it's often a question that comes up on a lot of security reviews. This happens to be a really common scenario of somebody accessed executives' compensation details inside of a development environment. You take a full copy of production, you put it into dev. There's no logging or masking. Things like that aren't happening. So now all of a sudden that data is going to be exposed, and we've had organizations that we've talked to that have had issues around that. It becomes a challenge to understand that. So it's something that you definitely have to keep up on. So tracking through some of those. So let's go back to those dashboards real quick. One of the things that we've had, I'm going to go through a couple of different ones of these. One, I'm going to start with after hours access, and there's not a ton of information in my development system or my demo system here, so I do apologize for that. But what this is really doing is letting you know usage outside of, say, an 8 to 5 window. Who's doing what at 2 o'clock in the morning? What are they trying to access? Those types of things. We've had, especially governmental organizations are kind of interested in this as to who's accessing information outside of the set, time of day that they should really be working. Going back to the dashboards as a whole, I'm going to look at the security one because this one's targeted more towards a security analyst to take some of that information out of the PeopleSoft admin so they don't have to provide so much to them. So we can see, let's go ahead and let's do today, see what kind of information we have from today. So we can see top 10 failed logins. So I can see that the PS that just happened when I attempted, or PS1 just happened when I attempted to log in, how often, what IP addresses that came from, failed logins by the user ID, how many times that's occurred. If I want to look at the different accounts, one of the things that's important is, Greg kind of alluded to it earlier, is certain accounts mean more to a security person than others. PS, VP1, those high privilege accounts like that, you have to know when somebody's attempting to maybe brute force those. So those types of things become very important. Where the accesses come in from. Where did those failed passwords, or attempts come in? Are you under a brute force attack from a particular country, for example? We've had some organizations that have dealt with that. So, quick geo map, because maybe your organization doesn't have anybody in India, China, Russia, something like that. So why would there be access there? Once again, we're going to see some of that sensitive data with the click to view and those types of things, because from a security admin, you're going to want to know that information from a security response perspective, maybe not from a compliance perspective. So there would be a reason to have some of that information. I can drill in and look at it as a much broader based view of this information as well. One of the questions that we often get as well is, what about thresholds, logging, automation? Let me know when something like that happens. So I'm just going to pull over my email real quick. And while I was going through some of those transactions, I can set up, I had a failed login alert come through. So it's, the IP address, the user ID. So a quick notification, then that came directly through to me. I don't have to go look at the dashboards on the information that I maybe want to know about instantaneously. It can be fed to me. We can also do Slack alerts if you want to. Click to view. This is that somebody generating and actually viewing the sensitive information. So maybe this needs to go to auditors. We've had that request in the past, that information specifically goes to auditors because they want to get their organization out of the habit of using that sensitive information. Well, when you have that right away, it becomes very easy. It's always something that's difficult to track. And then also executive compensation. So same type of scenario. Whose data was looked at, who looked at it? Well, now not only can I have a date timestamp, I know what page they looked at it, who the employee ID was and who the user of the PeopleSoft system was at that exact point in time. So another reason why I was just kind of generating a little bit of traffic, because some of those questions come up. I'm going to go back onto the dashboards here real quickly, and I want to cover off one on performance, because I think this is really unique. What we're doing here is we've got about 85 different log tokens inside of the security platform that allows us to capture unique information about the transactions inside of your PeopleSoft system. So what we've done here is we're giving you information about how that system is performing. You can see on a whole, pretty quick performing system, the top 10 components that are accessed. Maybe you want to utilize that to preload the cache for your system, so you don't have to worry about having that load up in the morning if you're clearing cache every night. We're also looking at the different transaction areas. So what we're doing here is we're grouping that together by the owner. So once again, adding additional metadata about the transactions themselves to be able to answer additional questions as to maybe which transactions are you having challenges with, which groups of transactions, the device types that are accessing the system, also a map of the page access counts and the load time. But this is where it really gets exciting for me, being an architect in the past, was what does my performance look like by the location of where users are accessing it from. So you can see North America, I've got India, London, Canada, all sorts of different locations like that. Well, the nice part is we can drill into this. Up above, we had the information looking at the transaction sets or the owners. This is actually the individual pages and which ones are slow. So let's say this particular user from this IP address has got the slowest performance. Let's drill in and look at the information now on the dashboard specifically for this user. So I can see that their average load time is a little bit slower. I can also see the information that they're accessing is a little bit different than what my average user is. I can look at the application load times and I can see their peaks. I also know where they're coming from. So now I can see the average page load time for them, and I can compare what it looks like against everybody accessing the system. So it really allows me to drill in and capture very unique information very quickly about that individual user's use of the system, maybe they're accessing a bunch of transactions that are very unique for them or something like that, or maybe it's the fact that there's a bad server that I need to take out, rebuild, or clear the cache on. So it really allows me to drill in very quickly from an admin's perspective as to really where the challenges are. Going back to the dashboards real quick. These last couple down here are really designed specifically for understanding what a particular user has done. Greg talked, earlier about the different challenges and reasons for that. Maybe it's testing, maybe it's the fact that everybody's at home at COVID and you need to validate that they're actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. So we can drill in and understand all of the information, what pages, menus, components. A lot of these dashboards are filtering for sensitive information specifically. We have all of the menus and components that they've accessed behind the scenes, but we want to bring up the sensitive ones first, because that's going to be my first red flag. If they're accessing something that doesn't have any sensitive information on it, I'm far less concerned. I can drill into a particular user ID and go ahead and apply that, and I can see specifically and track what that user has done, where they've accessed, how frequently they're accessing, all of those types of things. So that allows me to drill down. There's a couple of different other dashboards. The usage insight. This one really allows me as an organization and a business user to understand what parts of the organization I'm using, eProfile, HR Core, objects. But as an admin, I can also look at it and see when my peaks and valleys of usage are. So now maybe I need to plan when maintenance needs to occur and things like that. So really allows me to target in exactly when my system's not going to be utilized, and I might be, taking it offline when not a lot of people are actually attempting to use it at that moment in time. So, and then user profiling allows me to see some additional data as to how they're working with data, accessing sensitive information, non-sensitive information in both a high privileged and non-privileged mode. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Greg so we can wrap up and start some questions here real quick.
Great, thank you very much, Greg. Just before I show you the last slide in here, I just want to remind that we will have time for just a few questions at the end. So if you've got any questions, just put them in the questions tab on the GoToWebinar interface. Right, so hopefully you're able to see the slide again by now. And the Appsian 360 advantage is really about having crystal clear ERP insights. We are about to provide you information about your application sets, how it's being able to be used, and what people are doing inside of it, like you've seen. And with that, you'll be able to provide the correct data to the correct people to be able to really make the business decisions that are required. That could be a decision about compliance or decision about what are my employees doing. It could be capturing information about mobile versus desktop. Do we need to provide more application usage for the phone? Or if we have a lot of people using phones already, maybe we need a solution for that. Anyway, with that, you can make better decisions. And this is extremely lightweight technology. I don't think we stressed enough how small footprint that actually is on your system, and the fact that it's near real time without a huge or any impact on the application performance. So notifications, Greg showed us as well. You can notify undefined events, so you can respond to something that it's about to happen, so that it really gives you the control of the data access back. And all of the data is stored on-prem. It is not being accessed by us or a third party, and you are the only ones that are able to see this information. So it really allows you to come to grips as what's happening inside of your ERP system and what that access means to you. It can start driving business decisions for you or how you're going to use that system. And what do you need to provide to the end user? Is it all working correctly? Are you having problems? And these kinds of things. So if I grab Scott back and see if there are any questions out there.
Yes, there sure are. And as Greg mentioned, you can certainly put those questions in the question section of the control panel. It's on the right side of the screen. Looks like a fair amount of people have already found that. Let's see. First question, Greg Wendt, if you want to take this one. We have people using LogMeIn to connect from home to work from their personal PC. Will this track the external PC and not just the office PC?
That's a really good question. What that's going to boil down to is how that session is actually created. We've had a couple of different organizations really have some challenges with that. If the user is really accessing the work PC and that's where all of the transactions are occurring is on the browser on that work PC, then it would track there. If it's really on the end computer where they're not really doing a screen share of their work computer, then it would be the computer there. So what we do is we look at the X-forwarded 4 IP address that's connected in. So as long as that's populating through, we should have that information.
Okay, great. That's a fairly common question. Does this track activity on custom pages as well?
Yes, it does. It will track activity on any of the pages inside the PeopleSoft stack, and it's, from that particular perspective as well, it's really vertical, whether it's HCM, finance, CS, all independent.
Okay, very good. Another pretty common question, since we're talking about customizations, what changes are required on the PeopleSoft infrastructure? Are there any customizations that need to be applied for implementation?
There is a project that gets loaded into the database to configure the logging that's required for this. And then there is a plugin that goes on the PeopleSoft web server that gets plugged into the PeopleSoft Internet Architecture, the PIA, that will enable the logging to function correctly. Everything else is outside of the PeopleSoft stack. There's an additional server that gets plugged in that actually holds the Elk server that the Elasticsearch and Kibana that you actually saw with the dashboards and visualizations. And another common question is, are we using the PeopleSoft delivered one? No, we're not, because we're actually using a more up-to-date one, and we didn't want to be tied into the People Tools release version of which Elk stack they were using.
Okay. Let's see here. Yep, another common question. How long does it take to implement?
Great question. It pretty much is exactly like the rest of our application security platform, about 30 to 45 days most of the time. Or the nice part is you don't have to implement multi-factor and all these other type of things. You can really do a lightweight implementation of logging and some of the other features to make it very quick to get installed. So timelines are just within the normal process. It kind of goes back to the normal change flow inside of a PeopleSoft system, since you do have to install the plugin that sits inside PIA, so there is the migration through your development stack.
Okay, very good. I think that's all the questions. Greg, would you like to quickly wrap us up before I close her out for good?
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, there are some good questions in there. I'm really glad that it seems that I covered everything, and Greg was able to cover all the things that he missed in the Q&A. But yeah, thank you very much for your time and attendance today, and you can find us at appsian.com. You can email us, and if you have any further questions, we'll be more than happy to answer them. So with that, I hope you've got a great rest of your day today. Keep safe.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. Greg, you guys have done an amazing job. It's been a long day, but it's been a great day. I would like to encourage everyone to check us out, Appsian.com. You can learn more about not just the application security platform, but Appsian 360, the product that Greg demoed. And you can certainly request a deeper dive right there on the website. And lastly, I would like to mention that we are planning future PeopleSoft Innovation Summits right now. So on Friday, you should all be receiving a survey, and would certainly appreciate your feedback on how things have gone today. And then tomorrow, obviously would like to encourage you to check out the agenda for tomorrow. A lot of great sessions covering OCI, covering harmonizing the PeopleSoft user experience across page versions. There's a lot of stuff tomorrow, so definitely check out that registration page. And we'd also like to encourage you to follow Appsian on LinkedIn and Twitter. That will be the first place that you can learn about future events. Obviously, Appsian.com, a lot of really great information there. So the day is over. So we will see you guys tomorrow at 11 a.m. Central Time. And until then, thank you so much for joining the PeopleSoft Innovation Summit, and have yourself a great evening.